morning, and welcome to Session 1G of the McMullen Naval History Symposium, the 2021 McMullen Naval History Symposium, German naval operations on the North Flank from the 19th century to the 21st century. I'm Randy Papadopoulos, a historian with the United States Navy. Actually not a historian anymore, I'm a strategist. I'm still learning to correct myself on that. I work in OpNav as a strategist. Today we have three excellent papers covering the span of German history, but since the 19th century to the present and even a bit into the future. Two of our presenters are remote to today. Do we have Zampieri as well, Mr. Lawrence? Just a moment while we do some administration. We're all new at this, everybody, so I apologize for being awkward.
What's your name, sir, again?
Johannes Peters and
Yes. No, I know they're not here, but
okay.
There's a fourth name on the panel on the program. So in order then, the first speaker will be present in the room with me. That is Dr. Heiko Herold. He's an independent scholar. I'll introduce him properly in just a moment. He'll be followed by Johannes Peters from the Center for Maritime Strategy and Security at the ISPK in Germany. Our third presenter this morning, also presenting from Germany, is Julian Pawlak at the German Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies at Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. The three presenters, the first presenter will be, as I say, presenting in person. The other two papers will be presented remotely from across the Atlantic. Following that, our commentator, Tobias Philbin, at the Institute for Security Policy, who's an independent scholar, will be doing the commentary at the end. And as you can tell, I'm a bit flustered, and it's been a long morning already. So without further ado, let me proceed to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Heiko Herold is an independent historian and publicist. He studied early and modern history, economic history, and media science at Düsseldorf University. His dissertation analyzed the role of the Imperial German Navy's cruiser squadron in East Asia as an instrument of colonial and world policy between 1885 and 1901. He's the author, co-author, and editor of numerous publications focusing on German naval, maritime, and colonial history, as well as U.S.-German relations. From 2011 to 2019, he worked as a public affairs specialist at the U.S. Consulate in Hamburg, Germany. Heiko, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Randy.
We'll come up with that, but whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
This way.
So, first greetings to Johannes and Julian remotely. We chatted a lot along when we organized the panel. So my presentation will be on the Imperial German Navy and the Colonial expedition to the Arctic Bear Islands in 1898 and 1899. The deployment of the Prussian expedition to East Asia in 1859 marks the beginning of Prussian-German overseas base policy. In the following 2 decades, the Prussian, then Imperial German Navy, established naval and coaling stations all around the globe, initially with a focus on East Asia, the Caribbean, and East and South America. By the mid-1880s, when the German Empire acquired its first colonies, the German Navy vessels stationed overseas mainly relied on British infrastructure to fulfill their missions. German out-of-area interventions before World War I culminated in the 1890s and early 1900s. This included the search and acquisition of overseas territories as part of a greater overseas base policy, with a regional focus on East Asia, the Caribbean, and the South Seas. A nearly forgotten episode is the German Navy's efforts to occupy the Bear Island, located in the Arctic Ocean halfway from Tromsø to Svalbard in the late 1890s. The main goal of these efforts was not to establish a naval base, but a coal station for trawlers and to secure the rich fishing grounds of the area. This paper aims to show and analyze the 2 Bear Island expeditions in 1898 and 1999. These expeditions were supported by the Imperial German Navy, financed by the German Department of the Interior, and officially conducted by the influential German Fisheries Association. Next slide, please. The paper includes, good morning. The paper includes research results of my recently published academic study on the biography of Paul Friedrich August Woodman, my great-great-grandfather, who was a German merchant navy captain from Elsfleth on the Weser and, in the last decade of his life, from 1888 to 1898, a pioneer of German steam deep-sea fishing. One of Woodman's trawlers, the August, participated in the 1899 Bear Island expedition. The first unsuccessful experiments with steam trawling date back to the mid-1830s, but, quote, the final breakthrough was not achieved until 1881 with the Zodiac, a ship 34 meters long and built in Grimsby. Quote. The new technology was quickly adopted by other fishing companies, not only in Great Britain, but also many other, mainly European countries. Within 20 years after the Zodiac had been put to service, hundreds of European steam trawlers were already fishing in the North Sea and the Arctic Ocean. The largest fleet was stationed in Grimsby and comprised 471 steam trawlers in 1900. In February 1885, Friedrich Busse from Geestemünde put the first German steam trawler Sagitta to service. Next slide, please. Initially, most fishing companies were skeptical about the new technology and continued to use sailing trawlers, but their attitude changed in the following years. Steam trawlers were more expensive to build and operate, but they were able to catch larger amounts of fish, and this all year round, regardless of weather, even during the stormy fall and winter months. By the turn of the century, the German steam trawler fleet comprised 123 vessels. Most of them were based at the mouth of the Weser River in Geestemünde and Bremerhaven. In the second half of the 1890s, the main fishing grounds of German steam trawlers were located in the mid and northern North Sea, the Skagerrak and Kattegat, and, to a certain extent, along the British coast and the Hebrides. They did not fish at the high seas, as one might think, but at shelf areas near the coast and a few other upwelling areas, though far away from the German coast, because larger shoals of fish were concentrated there. The fishing grounds were mainly chosen according to haddock occurrence, steam trawling's main fish species. Other important species were cod, coalfish, plaice, hake, sole, and turbot. In these years, Iceland's rich fish waters increasingly gained importance. Initially, fishing there focused on haddock, then cod. Before the turn of the century, German steam trawlers generally did fish at Iceland's southwestern coast. Later, they extended their fishing grounds gradually along the whole southeastern coastline. The rule of the thumb was, quote, in summer, fishing trips ranged further north, up to the Scottish and Jutlandish coast, yes, for several years, even up to Iceland. In winter, the steam trawlers generally stay in the proximity, end quote. Step by step, they exploited even farther away maritime areas. Just before the beginning of World War I, German steam trawlers were fishing in the North Atlantic, Norwegian Sea, Barents Sea, the western coast of Morocco, the Mediterranean, and even the Red Sea. Why did they look for more and more remote fishing grounds? Even then, a phenomenon became noticeable that would expand globally and aggravate massively in the following decades. A decrease in fish populations and, correspondingly, fish yields resulting from overexploitation. Quote, they already began talking about an overfishing of the North Sea and complained about a decrease of holds in 1890, end quote, states fishing biologist Werner Schnakenbeck. This was an immediate result of the rapid industrialization of deep-sea fishing in Western and Northwestern Europe. At the same time began also the discussion of possible protection measures for affected fish populations. For example, the Northern County Commissioner Wilhelm von Boris suggested, quote, fence seasons and fence areas for steam trawlers, as well as regulations for net weight and vessel speed during beam trawl operations, end quote, at the Bremen Marine Fishing Conference in September 1890. This problem increased after the introduction of otter trawl nets because now they could haul much larger quantities in a much shorter time. Quote, the problem of overfishing, says Ingo Heidrich, has a historical dimension that reaches back at least to the introduction of steam trawlers and otter board trawls during the last decades of the 19th century. Because of the overexploitation of fish populations in the North Sea, the Skagerrak and Kattegat, German steam trawlers were looking for more and more remote fishing grounds since the mid-1890s. They paid special attention to Icelandic and Arctic waters. To be able to better exploit these fishing grounds, the influential German Fisheries Association, or GFA, aimed to establish a fishing station north of the 61st line of latitude. GFA President Dr. Walter Herwig saw an opportunity for this when he learned that Kaiser Wilhelm II had advised the government at the beginning of August 1897, a few weeks before the occupation of Kiaochu, of his intention to send a navy vessel to the Bear Islands to, quote, quickly occupy it and then offer it to the Russians as compensation for our wanted harbor in China, end quote. Next slide, please. However, this idea was discarded, but the Northland enthusiastic Kaiser still flirted with the idea to establish a German base in the Arctic. Herwig took advantage of the situation. In January 1898, he suggested the Imperial Naval Office to send several naval expeditions to the Barents Sea with the participation of the German Fisheries Association. They ought to look for a suitable base for the establishment of a fishing station at Svalbard, the Bear Island, or Jan Mayen under the pretext of oceanographic and hydrographic research. Herwig's main goal was to secure paramount fishing rights in the area. Hence, he cooperated yet again with the Imperial Naval Office in a colonial political issue because it promised advantages for the development of German steam trawling. Rear Admiral Alfred Tirpitz supported Herwig's proposal to disguise an already planned colonial expedition as a fishing research expedition. He also adopted most of his implementation proposals. In June 1898, he deployed the cruiser corvette SMS Olga that occasionally served as fisheries protection vessel in the North Sea on a multi-week training mission to the Arctic Ocean. Next slide, please. The GFA equipped it with different tools for deep sea fishing, including bottom trawl nets, herring drift nets, long lines, and shark lines. Moreover, a GFA commission of 6 marine scientists and fishing experts under the leadership of retired Captain Navy Richard Dittmar embarked, quote, whose task was to explore the hunting and fishing grounds at Svalbard and the Bear Island, end quote. The Olga crew also encompassed 15 experienced deep-sea fishermen, including some who had participated deep-sea trawling on German steam trawlers in the North Sea. They did not know about the mission's actual purpose. To finance the mission, the government doubled the annual fisheries budget for 1898 to 400,000 mark. Tirpitz gave secret instruction to the commander of the Olga and the expedition leaders, quote, to set up a base for German steam trawlers on the Bear Island, but to refrain from official actions of relevance according to international law, in particular an occupation, for the time being, end quote. However, the German polar explorer Theodor Lerner thwarted these plans with a private expedition that reached the Bear Island 3 weeks ahead of the Olga and had a similar agenda. Next slide, please. In mid-June, Lerner already seized a small area in the southern part of the island and demanded state protection. This news must have shocked the Olga expedition leaders. Nevertheless, they conducted their planned fishing experiments on the Svalbard bank and around the Bear Island, explored and surveyed a part of the island, and built 2 shelters for German deep-sea fishermen on the territory claimed by Lerner. Both the GFA and Lerner decided to send another expedition to the Bear Island in the following year. Herwig successfully applied for financial and political support of the government. From the public authority standpoint, Lerner did not qualify for cooperation because of his doubtful character and undiplomatic manner. In spring of 1899, the GFA chartered 3 vessels for the expedition. The Turnschoner Vigilant from Kiel, as transportation vessel for coal and other materials, the steam trawler Elma from Bremerhaven that was modified for whaling, and Woodman's steam trawler August from Geestemünde that got a reinforced stern for the fish catch in the Arctic Ocean. The Altona Council of Commerce Wilhelm Volkens, who was a member of the GFA committee, played an important role in the selection and chartering of the 3 vessels, but details about the selection process have not been consigned. Havik noted in his expedition report, quote, "After a thorough survey, we selected the best ships that could be made available in the 3 ship categories." Quote. The GFA selected the vessels a few weeks after Workman's death, when his nephew Johan Dietrich Seebed had just taken over his shipping company's management. Maybe Workman's former trawler captain Johan de Blom, who took command of the August during the expedition, or the Geestemünde harbor master Friedrich Juge, who headed it, recommended the steam trawler, but this remains speculation. However, both had known Workman very well and knew about the state of his trawlers. Furthermore, he had already chartered out a trawler to another company in 1895-96, what not every ship owner was willing to do. From the shipping company's management point of view, the chartering out was not only an increase in prestige, but also good business because the sales revenue always languished in spring and summer. In April 1899, the August was, quote, equipped with a heavy otter board for trawl, a lengthy tow rope, and a major steam winch, quote, in Hamburg, because the Swalbord bank, quote, partly had larger depths as were usually cast for fish at the moment, and these deeper sides need to be included in the fishing experiments, end quote. At the same time, the Elmas conversion to a whaler that lasted until June was also initiated. Meanwhile, the August and Vigeland already set out on their journey to the Arctic Ocean. Next slide. In transit, there the August had to tow the sailing vessel for a major part of the route. Officially, the GFA expedition ought to conduct further fishing and whaling experiments in the Arctic Ocean, build a blockhouse as a permanent base on the Bear Island, explore the local coal deposits, map the island, and make meteorological observations. In fact, also this research expedition only was a deception for colonial political purposes. That is to say, quote, the acquisition of a base for fishing in the Arctic waters on the Bear Islands, end quote. Kaiser Wilhelm II was afraid that Russia would preempt the German Reich and gave unambiguous instruction to the expedition leaders to, quote, clearly mark those areas on the Bear Island as soon as possible which are provided for German occupation, end quote. For this purpose, the Vigeland had a black, white, red painted flagpole and boundary posts on board, as well as a map, quote, where half of the Bear Island was marked as German occupation area, end quote. To underpin the claim of ownership, several expedition participants opted to winter on the Arctic island. However, also this time Lerner preempted the GFA expedition and once again interfered with its plans. While the August and Vigeland were not able to overcome the massive ice belt surrounding the Bear Island by June 23rd, Lerner managed to find a way with his rented seagoing tug and eventually set foot on the island 3 weeks earlier. Quote, we began a persistent 18-day struggle with the ice that we attacked with cleverness and force from different directions, he wrote in his memoirs. We often had to retreat when the ice bundled together and put the ship's propeller at risk, while we pushed forward continuously and enforced access to the island at last. End quote. Lerner seized the southeastern half of the Bear Island, fenced it with iron wire, and began with its exploration, including the coal deposits. What followed was a, quote, polar political farce, end quote, that even became a literary pattern. Lerner asserted his claims under threat of armed force not only against the GFA expedition, but also a Swedish expedition and the crew of a Russian Navy vessel, who both visited the island in the summer of 1899. When the German government learned about Lerner's action, it publicly distanced itself and made sure that his business partners from Hamburg withdrew their financial support. Quote, Lerner is a tragic character, judges Klaus Barthelmess. He was a conservative sympathizer of Imperial German world policy and became a clueless victim of a secret policy serving just this purpose, accidentally pursuing a similar plan to his own, end quote. At the end of July 1899, the German government dropped its plan to occupy the Bear Island and ordered the GFA expedition back home. Lerner's action had contributed to this decision. However, decisive was a diplomatic conflict with Russia that also claimed this territory. The Russian government was annoyed by the GFA expedition and sent a Navy vessel to the Bear Island. Its landing party demonstratively hosted the Russian merchant flag within sight of the GFA base on July 24th. The German government did not want to risk a serious resentment in the German-Russian relations because of the ownerless Fog Island, also quote. To keep face, it officially announced that, quote, the expedition had fulfilled its task, end quote. This was pretty much accurate for the practical and scientific research when the vessels departed the Arctic waters, but from a colonial political point of view, the expedition failed miserably. Quote, summing up the results of the 1899 expedition, concluded the disappointed Herwig, the fact that it was ventured at all may in itself be declared to be a success, end quote. The fishing and whaling experiments also fell short of expectations. Nevertheless, the specialized press was full of praise for both trawlers' accomplishments. They had proved successful, wrote the German Fisheries newspaper, Deutsche Fischereizeitung, quote, and evoked admiration and respect of the Norwegian polar fishermen, end quote. In the following years, further expeditions were sent to the Bear Islands, but neither the German Reich nor Russia were able to enforce their colonial ambitions. Since 1925, it belongs to Norway. Conclusion? Initially, Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to seize the Bear Islands in order to offer it as a compensation object to Russia for the planned acquisition of a German naval base in China. This idea was quickly abandoned, but the Kaiser's interest in acquiring a German base in the Arctic prevailed. Eventually, Admiral Tirpitz supported 2 expeditions to the Bear Island in the summers of 1898 and 1899. In order to cover up their real intentions, the expeditions were not conducted as official German Navy, but German Fisheries Association's operation. However, the deception efforts failed. The Germans eventually dropped their colonial ambitions in the Arctic when the Russians intervened in 1899 and sent a Navy vessel to the Bear Islands to dissuade from their annexation plans. The rich fishing grounds around the island could still be exploited by German steam trawlers until 1925, when the Bear Islands became Norwegian territory. Last slide, although it's more for the very end. That's the Bear Island nowadays.
Second presenter is doing so remotely. It's Johannes Peters. The second presenter, Johannes Peters, studied politics and history at the Universities of Rostock and Kiel. After completing his studies with an MA thesis on piracy off the Horn of Africa, he worked for the German Shipowners Association, the WDR, in Hamburg as a director for security policy. Since 2017, Johannes is with the ISPK's Center for Maritime Strategy and Security, focusing on undersea warfare, and signing up for responsibility as the project manager for the annual Kiel International Sea Power Symposium held 2 weeks ago. He currently heads that project. Johannes has conducted numerous presentations on undersea warfare, piracy, and transatlantic maritime security matters at the Military Academy of the German Armed Forces, Christian Albrecht University in Kiel, the Baltic Sea Forum, and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. He is a frequent contributor to subject matter journals and the media as well. Johannes is presenting today the evolving role of the German Navy in the underwater domain from the Cold War to the present. Johannes, I hope you can hear me. You're on.
Yeah, thanks, Randy, for this kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. Should be just fine, right? Okay. First of all, Heiko, Julian, good to see you. Heiko, thank you for your most excellent presentation. And also thank you, USNA, for having me and for putting this event together. As Randy has pointed out, I will speak on the evolving role of the German Navy in the underwater domain from the Cold War to the present. During the Cold War, the NATO strategy in the Baltic Sea was to contain the Soviet Baltic fleet east of the island of Bornholm, to delay any westbound advance towards Jutland and the Danish Strait, as long as possible to enable Allied reinforcement, mainly from the UK and, in the second step, the US. Western Germany as a frontline state was assumed main battleground in a war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the German Navy played a key role as a buffer stop for the Baltic fleet. It therefore maintained a fleet of fast attack missile boats and coastal submarines tailor-made for the shallow Baltic Sea. The current Class 212 Alpha air-independent propulsion submarines are certainly more out-of-area capable than their predecessors. Their main area of operation remain the waters of the Baltic Sea, the Danish Strait and the Norwegian Sea, which altogether form the so-called northern flank. Julian will elaborate in detail about this. While there's a consistency in the operating area, the role of the German Navy has changed fundamentally from a de facto unindependent allied tool to a medium-sized navy actively proclaiming a leading role for the alliance on the northern flank. My paper aims to analyze how the operational and strategic role of the German Navy has changed in the underwater domain over the past decades, both within the strategic framework of the alliance, as well as in the perceived role of the Deutsche Marine. It further examines how Germany could and shape the future undersea environment, giving its in the Baltic, given its operational and tactical knowledge, industrial base, and ambition. With the rearmament of the Western Germany and its incorporation into NATO, it became clear that the Bundesmarine, given its strategic value at the Baltic Sea inlets, should also become a submarine force again. Unlike the Soviets, Western allies had put a stronger emphasis on rebuilding a functioning administration and economic recovery within their sectors instead of really pursuing a deep denazification. In regard of submarines, 3 subject matter experts were still active in the field. The engineer, former Kriegsmarine submariner and later submarine designer Ulrich Gabler had taken over the design bureau he had been working for since 1938 in the northern German city of Lübeck. His company, EKL Gabler, should become the designer of all German submarine classes until today. Within the German procurement agency, Bundesamt für Wehrtechnik und Beschaffung, Gabler's former boss at the Kriegsmarine submarine design unit, Dr. Karl Fischer, and another former submariner became responsible for the development and introduction of new submarines. These 3 men formed the intellectual and administrative backbone of the re-establishment of the German post-World War II submarine force in the 1950s and 60s. To bridge the gap until new platforms would be available, Germany opted for a rather unconventional approach. 2 Type 23 and 1 Type 21 Kriegsmarine sub, which were sunk by their crews in the last days of the war in accordance to the famous Regenbogenbefehl, were salvaged from the North, respectively Baltic Sea, refurbished at Deutsche Hofhaltswerke shipyard in Kiel, and recommissioned with the Bundesmarine as Uhai, Uhecht, and Wilhelm Bauer. Assigned to the newly established submarine training unit in the city of Neustadt at the Baltic Sea, these boats were primarily used to train new submariners across all ranks and to build up new crews until new platforms came into service from the early 1960s on. Beginning in 1959, Hofhaltswerke shipyard in Kiel built 12 coastal submarines with a displacement of 350 tons for the Bundesmarine, named Class 201. Made of amagnetic steel and equipped with 8 torpedo tubes, the first boat entered service in 1962, facing serious problems with the welding seams in the early years. From the 4th hull number on, the boats lengthened by 8.8 meters to accommodate a wider sonar base, increased them to 420 tons displacement, became the Class 205. Acknowledging the changed strategic and operational requirements, the Western European Union in 1962 increased the tonnage limit for German subs to 1,000 tons. In the following, Hofhaltswerke was chosen as lead contractor to build and deliver 12 new submarines, plus a replacement for the earlier 205 hulls. Altogether, 18 new Class 206 submarines entered service until 1974-75, forming the operational backbone of the Cold War Bundesmarine submarine force. While the fielding of the 205s in 1962, with the fielding of the 205s in 1962, the operational phase of the post-World War German subs began. Focusing on gaining operational knowledge in the early years, the first NATO assignment in 1969 ended the phase of regaining sub-sea legs again. The fielding of the Class 206 and the introduction of the first wire-guided torpedo meant a tactical and operational quantum leap, and while the operational focus remained on the Baltic Sea, German submarines operated regularly in the North Sea and the English Channel as, e.g., sparring partners for NATO ASW forces. Nevertheless, their role within the strategic NATO framework was clearly defined. In case of a major conflict, the boats would have been assigned to predefined boxes east of Bornholm to A, use their mine-laying capabilities to block the Polish and Baltic ports, and to B, cause as much havoc as possible to Warsaw Pact reinforcement convoys with their wire-guided torpedoes. At the end of the Cold War, fleets on both sides of the Iron Curtain were designed to and highly sophisticated in either conducting submarine operations or countering them. The same goes for the German Navy submarine fleet, consisting of 24 platforms in 1990, tailor-made for the shallow Baltic Sea, operated by highly sophisticated crews. Instead of patrolling their boxes east of Bornholm, these crews found themselves conducting port visits in Gdansk and the Baltic states in 1901. While the proud Soviet fleet fell victim to the economic, political, and social turmoil in post-Soviet Russia and its former satellite states, Western navies were quickly committed to new but different tasks that made less use of submarines. In absence of a peer sea control competitor, NATO's future role was questioned, and the alliance had to adapt its role within the international security architecture, or alternatively, become history itself. Out of area or out of business was the motto of the hour. NATO units began to play an important role in conflict and crisis management in the Eastern Med, the Persian Gulf, or the waters around the Horn of Africa. To remain relevant as a reconnaissance tool as well as ASW sparring partner, and to maintain their own operational readiness, the German submarines had to follow the surface fleet into the waters of the North Atlantic, but especially into the Mediterranean. It therefore had to change its operational posture completely. Instead of 3 weeks, boats were deployed for 3 months, while the long transit times limited the operational value of the deployments, but increased wear and tear of the platforms dramatically. To overcome these shortfalls, procedures that have become normal for the German Navy nowadays, like crew changes abroad in the area of operation, forward deployed maintenance and training, were first tried and introduced by the submarine force in the 1990s. On the political side, there was a strong appetite to cash in on the so-called peace dividend after the victory of the Cold War. This led to a broad decline in defense budgets and a significant shrinking of NATO's fleets. Today, all Western navies operate a significantly smaller battle force than in 1990. For the German submarines, this meant dramatic cuts. Operating a fleet of 24 boats in 1990, this number had halved by 2005. The same year marked the fielding of the world's most advanced conventional submarine within the German Navy. 4 Class 212 Alpha, equipped with fuel cell Independent Propulsion, entered service until 2007. But with the decommissioning of the Class 206 in 2010, the submarine fleet reached its all-time low, consisting of only 4 boats. Joined by 2 additional boats in 2015 and 16, Germany currently operates 6 Class 212 Alpha submarines. With the so-called German-Norwegian Submarine Corporation, which got parliamentary approval this summer, 2 newly developed Class 212 CD, common design, boats are about to increase the fleet to a total number of 8 boats until 2035. However, numbers can be betraying sometimes. The 4 boats of the first batch are in need for major refits, scheduled to take approximately 2 years per platform. The same goes for the 2 boats of the second batch from 2030 onwards. While the older boats will come to the end of their service lives by 2040. A realist should plan with a number of 4 operational subs for the coming decade. For the German submarines, the main area of operation is the northern flank, with a special emphasis on the Baltic Sea. To examine why this area of operation is of relevance for the German Navy and its submarine force in particular, this paper looks at 3 aspects: operational, C2 and intelligence gathering, and the undersea domain. Operationally, the German Navy is wearing 3 hats: the National Defense Head as a branch of the Bundeswehr, the Collective Defense Head as an allied navy, and the Force Provider Head for EU and UN-led operations. The latter binds its units mostly in the waters of the southern flank. The current deployment of the Fregatte Bayern into the Indo-Pacific to underpin the Indo-Pacific guidelines issued by the German Foreign Office last year seems to strengthen the impression that the operational focus is more down south than up north, at least on the surface. The NATO head is represented in Germany's commitment to the standing NATO maritime groups. Sailing in at least 2 of them constantly had become kind of a raison d'être over the past years. The new chief of German Navy, Vice Admiral Schönbach, gave a remarkable speech earlier this year. He pointed out that he wants to further sharpen the Navy's spear in regard of high-intensity warfare, aiming at sailing with the carrier strike groups instead of deploying his units to the standing NATO groups. It will be interesting whether and how these plans will alter the Navy's posture. A leading role proclaims the German Navy in the Baltic Sea. While far away from, for example, the GIUK gap, this might be of relevance in case of a horizontal escalation, if NATO decides to contain a regional conflict in the north by increasing pressure on Russia along the entire northern flank, or vice versa. As for the Baltic Sea, as my good friends and colleagues Sebastian Bruns and Julian Pavlak had put it, the reversed Las Vegas rule applies. What happens into the Baltic does not stay into the Baltic. Further, it surely is of relevance in regard of providing NATO with a comprehensive operational picture along the entire northern flank. This is complemented by the German Navy's ambitions toward regional leading responsibility with the establishment of the German Armed Forces and the Baltic Maritime Component Command. The German Armed Forces, or DOI MAFOR, serve as a national headquarters for planning and operations. It will represent the core of the Baltic Maritime Component Command, a multinational command center the German Navy intends to use and provide for allied operations, not only in the Baltic, but along the entire northern flank. Further, the German Navy applied for resignation with the Baltic Maritime Coordination Function by NATO MARCOM to bundle regional NATO expertise. Of special relevance is the area of operation for the German Navy in the field of intelligence gathering and the undersea domain. Since the Cold War, Germany has been part of an exclusive club with the NATO nations, sharing sensitive ASW intelligence data, particularly focusing on the GIUK gap. Never abandoned though, it became less relevant after 1990. This has changed obviously within the last years. Moreover, Germany is expected to have its share in collecting and providing those data. Currently lacking surface assets to fulfill this task, strong emphasis is put on its submarines and MPAs. The Navy's strong argument for the Boeing P-8 Poseidon as a stopgap solution to replace its aging P-3 Orions makes sense here, as it provides fast, long-ranging ASW and ISR capabilities. While being an integral part of a comprehensive C4ISR structure is fundamental to bolster NATO's maritime awareness along the northern flank's waters east of the Skagerrak, the Baltic Sea currently evolves into an area of operation of its own kind. That the Baltic Sea is a contested theater is a given, but recent developments indicate that this is much more absolute. In case of a conflict, the sea and airspace of the Baltic Sea would immediately become a non-operating zone, not only for surface warships and fighter aircraft, but also for communication due to electromagnetic measures and countermeasures. The only remaining space for navigation, communication, and operation will be the water column. It will become a theater in itself. The party in a conflict scenario that is able to utilize this theater first and best will be the winner. To be able to do so, one has to generate the knowledge and set up the required infrastructure in peacetime. Seeing the underwater domain as a completely new theater is known as Seabed Warfare. Currently, Russia is very active in shaping this potential future battlefield to their favor in the Baltic Sea. In this regard, the recently completed Nord Stream 2 pipeline running all across the Baltic Sea from St. Petersburg to the German coastline must be seen as a huge threat not only to Germany's national security, but EU security as a whole. An article published by a group of Ukrainian experts argues that operating and maintaining the pipeline will be solely in the hands of the Russian company Gazprom. That includes all sensors to survey, e.g. the flow of gas, as well as fiber optic cables to transmit the data ashore. This sensor transmitter system has a huge dual-use potential. In short, Nord Stream 2 has the potential to be turned into a gigantic sensor chain under Russian control in case of conflict. Often warned, though, German politicians still insist that the pipeline is a solely commercial project with no security implications at all. To mitigate these risks and to regain at least some control over the pipeline and its connected data system, Germany and states like Sweden, Finland, and Denmark should insist to be granted access to information about points where fiber optic terminals are located, which might be used to connect and transmit data. Further, these terminals should be sealed to prevent their use for non-core purposes, namely to connect third-party sonar systems for transmitting information. In addition, Gazprom should announce every deployment of maintenance vessels in advance to the respective national authorities. While the suggested measures are political in nature, the founding question of this article was how Germany could and should shape the future undersea security environment in the Baltic, given its operational and technical knowledge, industrial base, and ambition. The German Navy's ambitions on the C2 field had been discussed. It should use its leading role here to actively promote the implementation of a layered ASW network in the Baltic. The Baltic states should invest in a system of listening devices, both seabed mounted and deployable, to create a sonar barrier right at the outlet of the Gulf of Bothnia, instead of seeking to acquire coastly platforms. Poland, in addition, could opt for an extra-large unmanned underwater vehicle with towed sonar area capability, instead of maintaining or seeking to acquire conventional submarines. Completed at the end of the food chain by the highly sophisticated 212 Alpha subs of the German Navy and its state-of-the-art signal intelligence ships, a layered ASW network would be established. Whether this comes under NATO or EU flag, Finnish and Swedish capabilities can be in or excluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you did your presentation, Johannes, you had no reason to know, as did anyone else online, that we are in the middle of a very severe rainstorm here. You started talking about the water column, and we feel like we're at the bottom of a water column right now here. That's my first parenthetical point. My second parenthetical point is one that I neglected to mention before you, but it actually is quite appropriate to mention it just before I introduce Julian, because of course you're both my editor. And since I have a copy of the book that you edited that I have an essay in, I thought I should put in a plug for, of course, From the North Atlantic to the South China Sea, Allied Maritime Strategy in the 21st Century. It makes sense to put in the plug for that right now, since you are two editors, and my editors in this case. And thank you very much for that opportunity. Our third presenter this morning is Julian Pawlak, a research associate at the German Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies, GIDS, at the Helmut Schmidt University, University of the Bundeswehr in Hamburg. His research focuses on maritime and naval strategy, as well as security policy in the northern, security policy in Northern and Eastern Europe. He is the editor of an ISPK series volume entitled From the North Atlantic to the South China Sea, published by Nomos Verlag, the book I just mentioned a moment ago, with Johannes. Previously, Julian acted as research associate at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University, the ISPK I mentioned a moment ago, and its adjunct Center for Maritime Strategy and Security. He has studied political science, sociology, international politics, and international law at Osnabrück University, the Jagiellonian University Krakow, and at the University of Kiel. This morning, Julian will be presenting Turned Tides at Europe's Northern Waters, the Northern Flank's Evolving Strategic Role from the Cold War to Today. Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Randy, and greetings to everyone from Germany. I'll just put up the presentation. So it's visible? I guess, okay. Great. Yeah, thank you, Randy. The Northern Flank's evolving role from the Cold War to the 21st century. All right. So the Northern European seas represent an epitome of turned tides, considering their strategic role and relevance from the Cold War to today. The renewed acknowledgement of that area is strategically relevant for European and NATO security and defense, followed the almost 25 years lasting period of neglect within Allied and in particular maritime strategy. It was not until the NATO summits of Wales and Warsaw that the transatlantic alliance acknowledged officially the rivalry it has to face in the region and beyond once more. So far, it's not the first time Northern European waters, recalled as the Northern Flank, play an important role for NATO and Europe, as well as Russia on the contrary. Particularly during the Cold War, the flank developed a crucial role for both blocs eventually. Yet, not only its strategic meaning in terms of Allied security and defense changed, but also its terminology and definition. To analyze its developing character, I will look at the region's evolving role from the beginning of the Cold War to today, divided into 3 consecutive periods. Firstly, the Cold War, subdivided in yet different scenarios for the region. Secondly, the post-Cold War period, also known as peace dividend. And thirdly, the beginning of a renewed great power competition. Despite its military nature, the term has been implemented in policy and academic literature, underlining the Northern Flank as an established notion. For this reason, the paper eventually pursues the question if the term flank is an appropriate one at all. Europe's flank during the Cold War. With the end of World War II, the corresponding division of Europe into the 2 Western and Eastern alliances represented the global bloc confrontation. With its global outreach, also the naval domain held a special role in defense and scenario planning for NATO and its member states. Yet, in the course of time, several changes in policy, the alliance's memberships, force structure, technology, capacities, capabilities, led to an alternating significance of particular theaters in Europe. NATO's strategic calculus was prevalently impacted by the widespread consideration of Germany as the decisive and central European battlefront. With examination of the historical events and literature, as in the NATO archives, Norwegian scholar Gerd Lage Dindal defines 7 scenarios for the Northern European theater which have been relevant during the Cold War chronology. For the discussion on the Northern Flank, I will exemplify them briefly in the following to structure its role during the decades of the Cold War. In the beginning of the 1950s, the formative years, NATO and US naval policy kept their strategic and operational focus on the southern European waters, mainly the Mediterranean. This altered quickly within the final years of the 1950s and, in light of the increasing Soviet threat, the growing concern for the Norwegian Sea in particular. It transformed to the central maritime area of operation for forward-based US and British carrier strike groups. Together with its strategic bomber air wing, including the just recently on Japanese soil elusively demonstrated nuclear component, it represented the predominant American air power. The air assets would have operated via Norwegian territory and parts of the Arctic towards the Kola Peninsula, striking those located air and naval bases and pioneering the routes for Allied strategic bomber fleets into the Soviet mainland. Following that purpose, the Norwegian Sea saw some of the first extensive NATO naval exercises, as 1952 main base with 4 US carriers of its second fleet and some 200 Allied naval vessels operating in the northern waters. Still, with the Western naval forces used predominantly for protecting its paramount carriers, the northern flank of the formative years represented primarily a military strategic independent front of the US Air Force bomber era of the 1950s. In parallel to this development, during the 50s and 60s, secure strategic continental focus also set the overall priorities for NATO. Hence, next to the air-dominated approach via the Norwegian Sea, the geography of Scandinavia's south, the Baltic Sea and its approaches were dealt as an additional tactical northern flank besides the main area of war, Central Europe. And yet, one fundamental change to that time led to first adaptations of the setting. With West Germany joining NATO in 1955, a subsequent main contributor to Allied military capacities, influenced significantly the military balance in Central Europe and also on the northern flank. The main focus for the alliance, however, continued to remain on defending its central region over that of the 2 European flanks or the surrounding areas. The Allied and in particular the US strategy of urging northwards from the North Atlantic was eventually confronted by the Gorshkovian approach of sea denial. Notably, following the emergence of strategic nuclear missile submarines, such approach was continuously fortified. With the Barents Sea as their main area of operation, the famous bastion concept of sea control in the Barents Sea and sea denial of any Western naval forces in the Norwegian Sea became significant. More precisely, the first SSBN developments with the Delta-class submarine in the 1970s and the naval arms race at sea had great influence on both Soviet and Western strategy development. With such potential, the SSBNs would not need to sail towards the North Atlantic to reach their North American targets. The alliance answered in 1980 with its concept of maritime operations, which focused on an offensive approach of containment, defense in depth, and keeping the initiative. Therewith, at the northern flank, it aimed at forward operating naval forces as well as aircraft carriers, which could hide in between the Norwegian cliffs and fjords. The crucial role of the Norwegian Sea became clear. With Norway and its territory considered as decisive in a potential battle for the Atlantic, the same was stated for a correspondent naval support. The war could not perhaps be won at sea, but it could easily be lost there. While negating any possibility of a long-term defense of the region at all, Jonathan Alford described the situation as the quote you're seeing on the slide. Who controls the Norwegian Sea depends on who controls the North Norwegian airfields. Who controls those airfields depends on who gets there first. And who gets there first depends on who controls the Norwegian Sea. For the fifth scenario, the northern flank for its part remained relevant to a lesser degree on the ground or the seas, as it was literally above, as the overflight route for the land-based strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles. This was the result of the evolution towards the missile age. With the US dragging behind the Soviet Union in terms of ICBM capabilities, the so-perceived missile gap became a driving factor for Washington. This development induced a new perception and the so-called mutual assured destruction lasting until today. The acknowledgement of the potential of mutual assured destruction led to the credo of avoiding nuclear weapons as the only reasonable answer to any also conventional aggression. Strengthening the conventional pillar was therefore important for conventional deterrence, but also for conventional warfighting without ultimate nuclear escalation. The flexible response strategy followed the trinity of conventional direct defense, followed by deliberate escalation, and eventually by the final nuclear response. Flexible response had therewith also a huge impact on the relevance of the transatlantic sea lines of communication. The need for credible conventional deterrence required the ability of bringing North American reinforcements via the North Atlantic to the European continent. Ultimately, the idea of conventional disputes shed the light also on both flanks as relevant peripheral theaters of war. The final Soviet fighting for access to the Atlantic Ocean scenario found its origin mainly in the 1970 Soviet OCAN exercise. As at that time history's largest peacetime exercise, the Soviet naval potential as a true blue water navy was not to be missed. With its impressive palette of naval forces, be it surface, subsurface, or air assets, it fortified its potential of operating globally whilst being able to protect its own strategic submarines, defend its homeland at increasing distances, support operations against the NATO flanks, and counter NATO's strategy of forward defense at sea. With NATO missing sufficient ASW and escort forces to that time, the transatlantic slogs were perceived at huge risks, and around 1,500 merchant ships was expected to be lost during the first year of the war in 1977. Going further to the post-Cold War period, it was accompanied by a large structural change of Northern European maritime and naval force structure. This change originated from the epochal shift the events around 1990 initiated. With several Eastern European nations relieved from the Soviet yoke, joining the transatlantic alliance as well as the European Union, the strategic balance in Europe was transformed significantly. No later than 2004, the former Soviet lake, the Baltic, altered into a sea bordering on 6 NATO nations, compared to only 2 during the Cold War, and all but 1 nations around being EU member states. The political rapprochement induced increasing relations with the Russian Federation politically and operationally. In 1994, with the introduction of NATO's Partnership for Peace program, the first PFP exercise, Cooperative Venture 94, was held in the Norwegian Sea, including, inter alia, the Russian Navy. With that, the former Soviet opponents started also to participate frequently in the long-standing NATO-US naval exercise Baltops until 2013. Having the northern flank serving for the most part as an area of approximation during that time, Western naval operations changed not only in that region. With the Soviet threat vanished, the peace dividend gained prominence throughout the Western nations and their navies. NATO and also the US Navy diminished many of its previously so important high-intensity warfare and ASW capabilities. The strategic change gave increased prominence to littoral sea supremacy, strike and amphibious operations, and military operations other than war, and far less to open ocean sea control. Exactly 20 years after the beginning of the PFP program and the first common naval exercise, the war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea shattered the European security system, and another East-West antagonism was back in place. The development of the peace dividend era were now subjects of a fallacious past. NATO's defense posture, particularly for the northern flank, changed with a fundamental paradigm shift back to collective security and territorial defense. The regional consequences were characterized for most parts as reassurance measures and the reassessment of strategy and force structure, as well as strengthened exercises. They included a Baltops, Northern Coast, or Trident Juncture 18, the latter being not only the largest NATO exercise since the end of the Cold War and the largest in Norway since 1980, but also since then first to include a US aircraft carrier operating in the Norwegian Sea. In the present day, the strategic situation is shaped by the renewed great power competition between the Russian Federation and NATO, or the US more specifically. On a first glance, NATO and EU countries dominate the region from the GIUK gap to the Baltic and up north. In more detail, however, Russia incarnates a comparatively overwhelming military force in the region, giving itself the initiative to act in any case of conflict, deliberate or accidental, against its smaller NATO neighbors. The Western allies are only combined in the position of defending themselves. Across the northern flank, naval forces from the alliance face a maritime domain peppered with several challenges on, below, and above the surface. For instance, in the deep waters from the Barents Sea towards the North Atlantic, they need to prepare for the already highly potential and still growing subsurface threat. Yet, not in a way of the fourth battle for the Atlantic, the region is still acknowledged as a contested battle space that cannot be ignored. The explanation exemplified the northern flank's changing significance during the Cold War in particular, related to diverging strategic calculi, operational plans, political constellations, and technical developments. With that, the terminology, including both the geographical and strategic meaning, have changed over time, as well as in the perspectives of different actors. For instance, the geographical shift of the northern flank's focal point from the Baltic approaches in the beginning up to the high north, which became fundamental in NATO strategy in the 1980s. During the quarter-century interlude following in 1990, the confrontational region was the center of an east-west rapprochement, allowing many flank states to join the transatlantic alliance and the European Union. After all, though, the region became again a taut era, a burning glass of tensions between NATO on the one and Russia on the other side. Despite the advanced developments, similarities to the northern flank of the Cold War can be identified. On the one hand, the Russian Navy counts on the bastion concept in the high north, as the nuclear pillar remains a central element in Russian deterrence architecture. On the other, the European allies are still depending on their North American NATO partners for supporting them in case of a major conflict with a peer competitor on the European continent or its adjunct waters. Differences can be identified mainly due to the new alliance members in the East, leading to changed planning of defense and reinforcements. For example, Allied slugs do not end in Antwerpen or Bremerhaven anymore, but in Tallinn, Riga, and Klaipeda. The question pursued at this point is if the term flank is still an appropriate one in contemporary context, considering the definition and change in areas, actors, and atmosphere in a strategic sense. The term itself originates from its military definition. The flanking attack is understood as an approach not aimed at the central, concentrated force of one's opponent, but rather on its less or unprepared sides or rear. Exerting on the scenario at hand the primary Cold War calculus of expecting the large and definite land battle in Central Europe led to the identification of the adjacent northern region as a supportive but secondary flank to the main events in the center, eventually naming it the northern flank. After the end of the Cold War, however, the term northern flank still was and continues to be in place, particularly since the return of the strategic opponent. It is now to a lesser extent understood as a flank in its initial sense, next to a central concentration of power as just described, but rather as a geographical description of a strategically relevant region, even though not currently defined. Nevertheless, one should keep in mind that this somewhat traditionally implemented wording at first, due to the lack of a main front, is confusing. As a second, for those located states, it is more than just a flank, and rather the central area of activity. Finally, the term flank can be understood in a broad, comprehensive sense, with the renewed great power competition not limited to Russia as a Western competitor. Along with global interdependencies and challenges, the northern flank represents one of many areas, geographically and strategically, NATO and the West have to cope with in the 21st century. Acknowledged as a collective strategic flank, covering the defined theaters of the North Atlantic, the North and Norwegian seas, the Baltic, and the adjunct landmasses, the northern flank could, in such sense, be recognized as a joint and combined strategic realm in Europe's north. A strategic area following its traditional name and therewith underlining the Western NATO perspective. Yet, it is still only one part of the global competition that emerged and is not limited to the traditional tactical function of an adjunct flank as it has been seen in the beginning of the Cold War. Thank you very much.
Our commentator this morning is Dr. Tobias Philbin, an independent scholar, retired professor, and naval intelligence officer. Received his PhD in war studies from King's College University of London in 1975, and is the author of The Lure of Neptune, German-Soviet Naval Collaboration and Ambitions, 1919 to 1941, which obviously focuses prominently on this region. And it indeed addresses both Nazi and Soviet use of the northern flank bases as a linchpin for world power acquisition at the mid-20th century. Toby, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You were there.
Wherever you want.
All right. Yeah, good morning. Thank you. I have a little story. Prepare one set and things change a bit. Okay. Taking chronologically, with two papers here. Germany's place in the Midnight Sun is the first one. And we'll start with this. Kaiser Wilhelm and our friend Alfred von Tirpitz, yes, indeed. Troublemakers, of course. Turn Tides, which is actually the second one, talks a lot about, defines the northern flank in historical terms. And the third one, the third table, which actually came second, the German Navy underwater domain. Oh my goodness. They are connected. They're connected because the overarching issues are economic, political, and military, and naval. Military needs the third category. Heiko Herold illustrates Germany's early effort to establish a commercial fishing base on Bear Island in the Arctic in the context of German imperial and commercial policy development at the turn of the last century. Alfred von Tirpitz and Kaiser Wilhelm are involved, although the base itself did not materialize at that point. What did happen was the development of a fishing, if you will, a fishing area of interest, which lasted a very long time. And very important, you see, the thing that transcended politics of that era was economics. It worked. And somehow they managed to deal with it up through the acquisition of Bear Island by Naval in 1926. Bear Island never realized any value as a potential down payment for a German base in Asia from the Russians because the Russians objected. They said, wait a minute, this is our backyard. No, not happening. Eventually, the Germans acquired Cao Chao for other reasons, something else. In any case, it's the most classically, this particular paper is the most classically historical of the three papers. A lacuna of interest, perhaps, and an area of future resource, but then again, there's something already written about it, is the Kaiser's secret civilian cabinet. Oh boy, there's some more stuff in there. If the German Kaiser continued interest in the expedition, who knows? But in any case, the Kaiser had interest in many things, most of which were patrol. Commercial activity, again, most important aspect of this particular paper. Then we go to term tides, which reaffirms that the northern European waters are an area of strategic change and innovation and importance, in which maritime security of the Western Alliance has long been recognized and is still there. It's a decisive importance as we see what's happening in the arena of melting ice and an effectively available northern sea route. I was not talking much about this for Neptunus. People have been interested in this route for a very long time, obviously. If you could take a major component of maritime commerce and move it out from under the potential blockage of the Suez Canal and cut the time about a third, you have a major change in the way global commerce works. So this is exactly what Russia's trying to do. And in fact, probably will happen. So maritime security becomes very important for that country. Now, okay. What is it noted in the paper is really, if you will, to non-European readers, is consideration of the northern flank as a geographic area. The northern flank is originally meant or considered, if you will, considered as a, if you will, a critical element of NATO's central front, north of NATO's central front. Today's complex underseas commercial infrastructure we're talking about, and is highlighted, especially in vulnerabilities. Good news is this now sets comfortably inside a half-century long NATO and EU multilateral allied context as compared to the previous century where we had the world connection. It is the geographic area included in the northern flank concept does contain a series of potential points of conflict. It goes from Latvia to Kaliningrad to Svalbard. So it's a dangerous area too. Something that we need to think about. And I'm glad the paper goes through revolve. It covers virtually every issue that you can imagine in regards to this. It's a good piece of reference. It really actually, it merits its own degree of strategic attention, which it's now getting. The paper, if you will, provides a strategic umbrella for the third paper, which is in fact the change in the German Navy's missions and focus from being basically a subordinate NATO command to being a Navy which is a second-ranked Navy, but it is a medium-sized Navy, if you will, with a whole different set of potential missions. The order of battle of the German Navy today is much smaller than it was in the Cold War. But then again, it has acquired the Type 212A. The Type 212A, I think, is a revolutionary naval platform for lots of reasons. Of course, the other problem is from an Allied perspective, not enough of them. There's never enough. Germans are cheap. Even under, they are cheap. You want to know the cheap? Tirpitz's memoirs talks about how cheap they were. This goes back a long way. They worship at the altar of cost effectiveness and political correctness sometimes. But very interesting changes here. It's very recent history, if you will, and reveal prognosis in the other paper about German undersea warfare. Some potential options in terms of dealing with the Eastern Baltic, which are technical and probably very, very effective in terms of underwater sensors or sensors which are not necessarily submarines, but something else, as well as it might be enough. What the Germans have is a small order battle, but the 4 to 12 of these submarines, which are capable of underwater independent operations, which are incredibly quiet, and global operations as well, but large enough so that they can be in many, many places. The question is, well, what if you have in a like the German admiral's talking about? What if you have a German submarine out there, 212A, along with a task force? Well, if the task force has an aircraft carrier, the Germans don't have one, but lots of their friends do. So the question is, well, who knows? Oh, I don't take one. Just take one. One might be enough. Anyway, what's really interesting here is parliamentary permission and Foreign Office approval have been given, apparently, for the development of the technological capabilities and the addition of additional units. Political and strategic implications of this are, again, this time, unlike this period, this time political strategic implications are securely connected to international allegiance and missions. The only ones who are out of this one, of course, are the Russians, who are not necessarily the good guys these days, unfortunately. It's also blessed by a whole cohort of bureaucracies. So stand by for some very interesting developments. It depends on how many resources the Germany wants to put into this, how much further they want to go. These are things that you guys have to look at. Your chance to go right on the German submarine, do that. Definitely do that. Air independent propulsion goes back to 1943 or thereabouts, and it didn't work. Didn't work. Germans lost some submarines in the process, and actually the Brits grabbed it and they tried it, and they lost a couple of theirs for the same reason. Couldn't figure it out. The Swedes, however, I believe, grabbed it and made it work. The Swedes, followed by the Japanese. Yes, the 90s. Also very interesting. And so you look at these things, and then there's this big historical issue. I'm done with this. That's all the papers, all connected. They all connect. They connect in strategic reasons, first of all, economic, overarching economic issues, which are the Northern Sea Route. That's the biggie. And Northern Sea Route, fishing grounds, Bear Island, that whole area. There's a couple of very interesting papers about the Russians that fortified the heck out of it from one end to the other. So you got a problem with it. Anyway, so those things are there. The economic, the military strategic, bastions. Oh my God. Bastions are damn dangerous. If you want to know how that was in the Cold War, there's two really good books about it. One of them is Blind Man's Bluff. Don't ask me any questions. The other one is Don't Ask Me Any Either. You guys are master submarine drivers about that. Blind Man's Bluff and We Come Unseen. It's the British one. Allies. Those two, read those. You will see that. But that's how dangerous it is. It's like the Russians' personal parts. It's very serious. So those two do that. And so there needs to be an awful lot of diplomacy. Diplomacy is a lot better than sending the Marines in. A lot better. A lot of diplomacy. A lot of additions to the Law of Sea UN Convention. By the way, there's a couple of things with this, but surface ships is okay. Submarines, in there. So those two things. look for that stuff. Oh, by the way, there is one other paper that you guys, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but this does not take anything away from the presenters, but Bradford Dismuth wrote in the Naval War College Review a thing called Return of Great Power Competition, volume 73, number 3, summer of 2020. And it goes into the Bastion issue more than you guys did, but I think it'll be useful. It's online, so everybody can look it up and read it. I knew Brad, God, 10 years at least. He and I were in the same Naval Reserve unit. It was a strange thing for seeing out, but in any case, and Brad is he is one of the grease and animals, the grand old men of this. So have a look at that. But there you are, 3 papers. They all address the same critical area, and there's many changes afoot. Keep an eye on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby. We have had heard from 3 papers and a commentator who talked about geography, and the panel title lends itself to that. As I was listening to your comments, though, Toby, it struck me that, in fact, we've gone from an oceanic area that was loosely governed, so that you had the good idea fairy of Kaiser Wilhelm saying, let's go up to Bear Island and set ourselves in the strategic void. Then became, of course, a theater for war in the Second World War especially, but the Baltic especially in the First World War too. Then rivalry during the Cold War, back to loose governance. And if we think that loose governance at sea doesn't matter, think of the strategic void that we might say about that loosely governed piece of water called the South China Sea as a direct analogy to this. And I think this gives us an idea for further thought and consideration. I thank the audience and the presenters, first of all, for speaking remotely. It's very hard to do. We're all, as I say, new at this, but I think it turned out very well. We could hear you quite clearly. I hope you can hear us. I now open the floor for questions. I'll start with people in the room. Preferences to midshipmen if they want to, but they don't have to if they don't feel comfortable doing so. And then I'll go to the audience online as well after that. So, does anyone have a question for the audience, for the presenters, please? No. All right. Yes, please. Keith.
I'm Keith Bird, and I just have it's a minor question, Johannes, is related to some things that I'm just starting to look into now, and also participating in the panel where we're talking, of course, about the effects of the Washington Naval Treaty and the issue of what type of restrictions there are on submarine tonnage after the Second World War. I think you mentioned something about they were restricted, and if there was some agreement on that. Again, it's not a major point. They were all excellent presentations. Right.
Just in case you couldn't hear him, Johannes, Keith asked a question about the tonnage restriction on U-boats after the Second World War in the Bundesmarine. Could you please explain that a little bit more closely for him?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Switch to the headphones. Yeah.
Oh yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
We blew our speakers. We weren't even 11.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. The tonnage limit was initially 350 tons by the Paris Treaty for German submarines after 1955, and then it was later increased to 1,000 tons in 1962 to be able to for the 206 class, they needed to be bigger to host especially the sonar equipment. They had to be significantly bigger, and then they increased the tonnage limit to 1,000 tons. And I think that was the case until 1990. Did it answer your question?
Yes, it did. A question on that too. A follow up on that. What have you come across in terms of Bundesmarine or Deutsche Marine submariner training? Have you been able to get access to details about what the syllabus includes and what sorts of things they're training for?
You mean from the beginning on, or actually, or what's?
are they training more for mining, or are they training more for power project, not power projection, but for sea control missions where they're active? You mentioned both use of mines and torpedoes in the Baltic, and I wondered, did this mean that they were considering the more stealthy role of mining, or actively going out and hunting for Soviet shipping in the Baltic? Have you been able to come across anything on that?
Yes, just recently, but only for the Cold War Bundesmarine. So they did both actually. I was told that they penetrated like Polish waters for like practice on mine laying during the Cold War. Not officially, of course, but they did. The 206 was equipped with both the mine laying capability and the wire guided torpedoes, and it was supposed to be used in both roles. So they practiced both.
Okay, very good, thank you. We have another question from Hal Friedman. Hal, come up closer to the microphone so they can hear you.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? Because I want to make sure I'm not sounding like an adult in the Charlie Brown series. Okay. Hal Friedman, Henry Ford College. It's really more a comment than a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
I think flank is entirely appropriate for naval history and naval studies, but it takes some getting used to. I think flank is perfectly appropriate even today, because that's what the admirals and captains doing strategic planning have been talking about for decades and decades. I mean, you can watch the movie Midway, the real one from 1976, not the recent one. The admirals are talking about being outflanked or outflanking the Japanese, and that's simply the terminology they use. But those of us who got started in military history by reading about ground fighting, you have to do some sort of mental shift to use flanks in naval studies. So it takes some getting used to, but I think it's a perfectly appropriate term used even today.
Julian, were you able to hear him clearly?
Not everything, but I think I got the point.
Okay, very good. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions then for the panel or comments, please? Do any of the people online wish to raise a question? I can't see if you have raised your hand at all. Is there anybody who wishes to raise a point? Is there not, I don't know if there's a chat. Nothing in the chat. All right. Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists for presenting 3 very fine papers and our commentator today. And please give them a round of applause. Those of you on screen, if you could wave your hands in front of your camera, please, so that we can express our appreciation. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Great seeing everyone. Hello, Anselm.